All right, everyone. Well, if you believe the stock market, Compass Pathways is less valuable today than it ever has been since it IPO'd. The shares fell about 50% today, closing at $2.35 a share, which is the lowest that it's ever closed at, as far as I can tell. And this is based on an interim readout of their phase 3 clinical trial of psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. They released not the full trial results, but just a little sneak peek today. And clearly the market did not like it. So Sam and I, say hello, Sam.
Hi, everyone.
Sam and I are going to discuss this clinical trial readout or interim readout and the market's reaction just in this quick kind of emergency podcast because it's pretty significant. Compass Pathways is one of the most important companies in the psychedelic world. They are leading the way and getting psilocybin approved for not just treatment-resistant depression, but getting psilocybin approved for anything. They're the leaders in psilocybin approval. And this was a pretty highly anticipated readout, highly anticipated study that they're running. And it's kind of wild to see this insanely negative market reaction. So we are going to discuss what exactly was said, what the facts of the readout were. We're going to discuss the market's reaction. And by the end of this, you'll know if we think the market is overreacting, underreacting, or reacting just right. So, Sam, you want to give us the headline? What exactly came out today?
Yeah, I want to chat a little bit about that. So this was the first readout from the first phase 3 trial that Compass Pathways was conducting or intending to conduct. They have a second phase 3 trial that's going to be scheduled for readout in mid-2026. And just to kind of level set, I guess, amongst everyone who's listening with what rumors have been saying, there have been people saying that, after this first phase 3 readout, that Compass might actually go to the FDA and try to get an accelerated new drug approval ahead of their phase 3 in light of the new administration. I think that was just hearsay. I don't really think that there was much merit to that. But really what was read out was one specific primary endpoint, which is called the point between group difference on the MADRS score. The MADRS score is a subjective questionnaire that's given for many indications in the psychiatric space, but it's given to patients to measure their feelings before, maybe during, and after treatment.
And it's basically just a survey.
Yeah,
right?
it's just a survey.
Questions.
Mm-hmm. There are like a set of secondary and tertiary questionnaires that are given. We'll discuss how we feel about these questionnaires and subjective measures later. But essentially, it's the standard, gold standard, I guess, questionnaire to look at how people progress in the depression populations. And I wanted to highlight specifically for listeners that this group of patients was a group of treatment-resistant depression patients. And so that's very different from major depressive disorder and other types of depression. This means that patients have tried and failed to respond and also remit from depression symptoms with other treatments before.
They have to have tried at least 2 other ones, right? I think it's 2.
I believe it might be even more.
Is it 3?
I think it might be more.
One of the 2. But you basically, if you want to be classified as treatment resistant, you have to have tried at least 2, maybe 3.
Yeah.
Other antidepressants or therapies.
Yeah. And we all know how bad that is. I mean, one of the reasons why people were so excited and still are excited about psychedelics to begin with is that psychiatrists really don't have a guide. It's trial and error depending on the person. And so clearly there's an unmet need. And the other thing I wanted to kind of preface with is that lately I've been spending a lot of my time talking with people in pharma that are mapping the psychiatric space, but also later stage investors that are interested in investing in neurotherapeutics companies. And one of the things that they've been saying is that they really are curious for the Compass Pathways readout because that will indicate to them something, whether or not it's a catalyst. And I think my goal and our shared goal for this podcast is to bring some kind of objective analysis as to what's going on. And I do want to preface with the fact that all psychedelics are different. There is no precedent for this. The drug matters, the dosing regimen, the dose, the endpoint selected, and many other things matter. And so we should take it with a grain of salt, whether or not this can be this can be used as a point of inference for the success of other psychedelic trials and non-hallucinogenic trials for that matter. So yeah, that's kind of where I wanted to start.
Okay. And so the data that came out today.
Right. Yes. So very specifically, all of that preamble, the data showed that the point between group difference on the MADRS score at week 6, so this was at week 6 after patients were dosed, was a delta of 3.6. Now, what does that even mean? So if you take a look at some of the other drugs that have been trialed that have led to approval and some that have not led to approval for treatment-resistant depression, there's a huge spread. I think one of the more, relevant examples is ketamine and esketamine and S-methadone. These are rapid-acting modulators of this receptor called NMDA. They generally give larger early deltas. And what I mean by that is early in the phase 3 analysis, when we're looking at the first set of patients in a phase 3 trial, deltas meaning this point group difference between patients and also the placebo arm. One other anecdote, and then I'll pause for a second. One other anecdote I want listeners to know about is that generally in most trials in psychiatric disorders, the placebo response is significant. And so looking at this delta between the placebo arm and the efficacy arm is really important. And generally, I think with regards to this patient population, anything that's 3 or larger is considered clinically relevant. It's considered a big win. And I think it, especially if there's statistical significance, it's an indication that the drug will probably work for that population. Now, before getting into the analysis, I wanted to kind of stop and see if there was anything you think we should clarify.
Yeah, I just want to make sure people understand what exactly the data was that was released today. So I'm going to just talk about it for 1 sec. So just so people know what actually happened. They ran a trial of psilocybin in people that had treatment-resistant depression. The way that it was dosed is that the people got a single dose of psilocybin. So not microdosing, not 3 big trips, not 5 big trips. They got a single dose of psilocybin, 25 milligrams of synthetic psilocybin. And before they got the first dose, they took this MADRS test, and then they got the single dose. And then 6 weeks later, they took the MADRS test again.
Right.
Okay, so that is how they measured the improvement or theoretical improvement in depression
score.
In depression as measured by the MADRS score. Now, they had 256 or 258, something along, 258 people in total in this trial. Half of them had psilocybin, half of them had a placebo. And then what they did is they calculated what is the average difference in the before that psilocybin dose and the 6-week post-dose measurement for the placebo group and for the active group, and then look at the difference between those two averages. And so you find like, what is the difference between the average change in the placebo group versus the people that actually got the psilocybin? And the difference was 3.6 points. That was kind of like the difference between the averages of those groups. And as we're going to talk about, we're going to put that into context, because unless you know what the reference is, 3.6 could be huge, it could be nothing. Spoiler, I guess, is that it's kind of in the middle.
Right.
But that's just what I wanted to make sure people understood. And the other thing I want people to understand before we get into the analysis is that this is a interim readout. This is not the final result of the trial. This is, companies will often do these interim readouts as sort of a preview. Oftentimes these are done before the trial is even finished. We're not sure what Compass will ultimately release. They will probably release a lot of other data. This is a single data point that they decided to release as sort of a sneak peek of what is coming next.
Yes. And maybe 2 other points before we get into the analysis again. I think it's important for listeners to know that generally speaking, with these larger clinical trials that are more meaningful and closer to the end of the drug development road, more sites, meaning the more clinical trial sites that are used to administer the drug and the placebo in this clinical trial design, the better, because there is variation, and more sites generally correlates with, I would say, more like even sampling. I think it's common sense. So
they had 32 different sites in this study, which is good.
It's pretty good.
It's a good amount. And so just to be clear, the only thing that this trial tells us is what the difference in response between the placebo and active groups were at the 6-week mark based on the dose of psilocybin that they gave them. They didn't do multiple different doses to experiment. They had 25 milligrams. That's what everyone in the active group got. So this doesn't tell us anything about how useful psilocybin at lower doses or higher doses is. It doesn't tell us anything about how effective psilocybin is 1 week after dosing or 1 year after dosing. It is literally just how effective is psilocybin at this dose between day 0 and week 6. That's the only thing you can infer from this data.
Yeah. And, you know, both of us did our research separately and are coming together right now. Like, I wanted to ask you if you had seen, I saw musings of the executive team saying that they're purposefully not even looking at any of like the secondary or tertiary endpoints or data themselves. I guess obviously to not bias any coverage or any like public announcements, but like, did you see anything specific about maybe more detail into the reason around why they're doing that, other than just not trying to preemptively state something that might not actually be true?
I think it's probably just to make sure that they are, that no one could accuse them of any improprieties.
Okay.
That would be my guess.
All right. So
do you want to comment on anything having to do with the data here?
I do, but I was going to ask if you could put like the steps into context around what happened with the stock, because there was some movement and there was some reporting that happened. Some equity research analysts put out some reports before. So
yeah, I'm down to talk about the stock, but I think before we do that, I think we should talk about how this outcome compares with other clinical trials of other depression treatments, whether they're psychedelic depression treatments or, you know, SSRIs or something. And then we can talk about the stock.
Yeah, I have my notes here. I mean, so generally speaking, I think we could talk about the stock and the analysis after. I'm just trying to separate my thoughts here. But so COMP360, which is this drug that is in question right now, the delta, let's call it the delta, was 3.6.
Between the placebo and active.
Between the placebo and active group. And I took a look at all placebo-controlled trials that have been conducted in treatment-resistant depression, and the results are honestly like really mixed. I think that what's been interesting to see is that, of course, GH Research, their 5-MeO-DMT drug, they had, I believe, a delta of something like 9. Was it something significant like that?
I'll tell you in a second. Much bigger, actually.
You're bringing it up. Let's see. Hold on.
So while Sam's pulling that up, let me just put Compass's 3.6 delta into context. So when you look at traditional antidepressants, Zoloft, which is the most commonly prescribed antidepressant in the United States, there have been a number of different trials, and meta-analysis suggests that there's a delta between the placebo and active about 4.1 after a number of weeks. Now, of course, this requires daily dosing, and you get all the side effects associated with SSRIs. Lexapro, probably the third or second most commonly prescribed SSRI or antidepressant. Meta-analyses of its effectiveness show a 3.6 delta, which is actually the exact same delta between placebo and active that Compass had.
This is in TRD, treatment-resistant depression?
In TRD,
okay.
Yes, in a specific one. Now, the Zoloft is in MDD, and it's tough to find data around TRD because a lot of these drugs have been trialed more for MDD than TRD. MDD meaning major depressive disorder, the most common type of depression diagnosis, TRD meaning treatment-resistant depression. The point is that probably part of the reason why this stock crashed is that Compass's 3.6 delta is not significantly different than what you see from kind of garden variety antidepressants that have been around for a long time. And I think that given all of the discourse around how amazing psychedelics are at treating depression, people were expecting a 10-point difference, maybe even a 20-point difference. And when it turns out that, yes, the Compass product works, but it gives you efficacy along the lines of what you can already get with Zoloft or Lexapro or Prozac, maybe it's not as exciting of a story. Now, I think, can I keep going for a sec?
Yeah, but okay, go ahead.
I think that the people that are kind of hating on Compass for this sort of lukewarm result are failing to account for the fact that these Compass results were achieved with a single dose of a drug, not a daily pill, and that this is sort of the first significant large end trial of a psychedelic drug, whereas these SSRIs have been trialed in different forms for a very long time, and we know how the dosing should be optimized, et cetera. There's very little optimization that has been done on the dosing protocol, the actual therapeutic protocol, the trip protocol, if you want to call it that, of the Compass drug. And I would suspect that as time goes on and we figure out how to use this product more effectively, you're going to see much bigger MADRS differences. The other thing that I would say, and I know you're chomping at the bit, and that's fine if you. So we have to also contrast Compass's results with the results of the two other major psychedelic drugs, one of which, yes?
I was just going to say, like, before we get there, you started talking about some like delta and MADRS score between placebo and patient arms in like major depressive disorder trials, which, you know, we can do for the sake of like the generalist biotech investor who's probably making those analyses. But I want to actually specifically cite some of the deltas for drugs that have actually been trialed for treatment-resistant depression.
All right, tell me.
So I brought it up, but you were going to say something about looking at some of the other psychedelic drugs.
We'll do that later. Let's. What data did you find about the differences for drugs that have been approved for TRD?
Yeah. So brexpiprazole, basically brexpiprazole was a drug that was looked at as an adjunct. So an adjunct is like an additive add-on therapy for people that are already taking a baseline SSRI like Lexapro. And the delta there was modest, and it was negative 2.15, but it was consistent and accepted for add-on benefit. And so I believe the Compass Pathways team had put out this statement before the results read out saying that they were hoping for something that was 3 or higher. So just put that into context.
It was 2.5, 2.15.
2.15. And if you look at IV ketamine, so ketamine is the active pharmaceutical ingredient that's in Spravato, but Spravato is used in a nasal spray. If you look at IV ketamine, which is directly administered into the bloodstream, the delta was 7.95, which is robust. It's a rapid effect, but it's short-lived.
At how many days?
That's actually the primary endpoint, I think, for that was read out at 24 hours.
So we're talking the difference between a day later versus 6 weeks later.
Right. And so this brings into the question of something called durability, which, psilocybin has been thought to have like very durable effects. Ketamine and other types of drugs like it are very short-lived, and they clear out much more quickly. To put that into even more context, S-ketamine, which is a form of ketamine, actually on day 28, the differential was 4. So, and this actually led to FDA approval. So I believe the sponsor for this, this was a J&J sponsored trial. So it's underperforming relatively compared to standard of care that looks great, which is ketamine, and obviously Spravato is on track to become a blockbuster. But I think the analysis is more nuanced around a few other compounding factors that might not necessarily just be this score itself. But I'll pause, and you were going to say something about comparing this to other psychedelics as well. So
yeah, so the one recent clinical trial readout that happened that had a lot of people talking was GH Research, which is a publicly traded company. They released a readout from their trial of 5-MeO-DMT for treatment-resistant depression. And they had a lot of attention in the press because their MADRS delta was 15.5, which is wild. None of the drugs that we've talked about on this podcast so far, not even ketamine, have anything close to 15.5.
And what was the time point?
Now, this is on day 8. So somewhere, not 24 hours, but also not 6 weeks either. But I think now there are some caveats here. They only had 80 patients in their entire trial, whereas Compass had 258. And I think that if there's like a meta point that can be made about what we just talked about over the last 10 minutes, it's that it's a lot more difficult than one might think to really determine how useful these drugs are relative to others, because there is no standard way to measure or report them. As much as people might want to think that the FDA has like a very established, consistent process that must be applied, that's actually not really true. Like, yes, they accept the MADRS score, but there's no rule that says every single drug has to be trialed in such a way where we measure it at day 0 and at day 60. As you can see, some of these trials measure at day 8, some of them measure at day 60, some of them measure 24 hours after, and they all come up with their own arguments as to like why this is the right way to measure it. And so it's very hard to just look at the headline number and say, oh, well, 3.6 is lower than Zoloft at 4.1. So therefore, this is like less effective. It's just not that simple. And then you have to take into account the frequency of the therapy. Is it a single time like Compass? Is it once a week like ketamine? Is it every single day like Lexapro? There is no easy way to analyze these things on a relative basis. And I think that in typical market fashion, there was a lot of attention put on this single number, this 3.6 differential. And there was some real quick kind of like, well, I see other numbers that are bigger, so this must not be good. And people just decided to sell.
Yeah, two things. The first is I agree with everything you're saying. I might counter or respond to what you said by attempting to do something I rarely do, which is like zoom out and be a little bit less technical about things. So I want to continue on that tangent for a second. The other thing is, upon my analysis of some of the commentary from some of these analysts and other people that have written about it, I think it might be what you just said for sure, like the single number reaction. But I've given these folks the benefit of the doubt and thought that maybe they had some more sophisticated reasoning behind it, which we can talk about afterwards too. So here's me attempting to zoom out. All right, so let's just think about these drugs from a practical perspective as well. Like, obviously, 6 weeks later, you should be able to see some effect from a drug. We know that traditional SSRIs take just that long to start kicking in. But practically speaking, something called functional data, which is basically like how well are you adjusting in your everyday life? Like those types of non-technical qualifying factors, like are you getting out more? Are you socializing? Are you exercising? That type of data, and also durability data. So again, looking at later time points to see whether or not this differential held, arguably is much more important for psychiatric drugs than this initial readout. So to your point, like I'm kind of repeating what you just said, but...
So your point is we also need better measurements. Like it's not enough to just look at the MADRS, even if we looked at it in a consistent way, you're saying, like looking at secondary measures around quality of life, et cetera.
Let me put it this way. Anyone who is well-versed in anyone who is an expert in like psychiatric drugs and clinical readouts, if you were like also doing public markets biotech investing, if someone said to me that they were basing their decision off of that one metric, I would be like, you really just don't know what you're talking about then. No expert would say that this is enough. I think this is a conservative move. It's a reactionary move, but it might even be blown out of proportion for some other reasons I want to talk about later on. But basically another way of saying what I just said is like, you can't really know what the effectiveness of the drug is going to be in a broader population until we get to the second phase 3. Like there's going to be more time points. And at the very least, like the modality of psychedelics in this medicalized context is so unprecedented. And so it just seems silly to be saying right away that this is not going to be commercially successful. So much to talk about. I also think that maybe analysts or whomever are placing a lot of emphasis on the fact that the treatment-resistant population is not commercially attractive. Maybe they are undervaluing the treatment-resistant population. At least from a health economics point of view, I think that it is a highly unmet and underserved market, but I don't know commercially if there are some assumptions that were made around how much this can be priced for, all that type of thing, all that type of stuff that I actually haven't looked into. So I don't know if you have any thoughts there.
Yeah, I do. You made quite a few good points, and you were talking a lot about the commercial success and how one can try to predict the commercial success based on all of these studies and these data points. But one question that I would have is based on just this one number, which of course is not all we're going to have. Eventually, we're going to get way more numbers around this. Do you think this is enough for FDA approval? Because the questions of commercial success are irrelevant until the drug is approved.
I don't know if the FDA is equipped with enough forward-looking thinkers to be able to like implement an approval on something like this.
Not even in Trump's FDA that just appointed a psychedelic czar and Matt Zorn.
Yeah, I mean, I would be curious to know what kind of conversations are being had. Actually, I think, given the Lykos failure and the concerns that the FDA had pre-Trump administration, going along that tangent, it seems like at the very least, what this Compass readout showed is that this is extremely safe. Like the safety and inferences made are pretty positive. So perhaps
we didn't talk about that at the beginning, but that was the one other thing that the interim readout said. It was that there was no real significant safety issues found.
Yeah. So if the new administration is moving more towards at least like basically overemphasize safety and then efficacy, let's be a little bit more experimental in areas of unmet need, then there is a possibility, I think. But I don't know. What do you think?
I suspect so, because it does seem like the effect size is in the realm of the effect size of other approved antidepressants.
Right.
So unless there was some real bad side effects or significant adverse events that came out later, I don't see why not. Mm-hmm. And then when you combine that with just the like political, social environment that we're in right now with Trump, RFK, FDA, it seems like it would be. And so then the question from there is commercial success. And I had this thought come in, kind of show up when I was thinking through this, because there's all this talk about the MADRS score. And I'll ask a rhetorical question here. I'm not expecting you to know the answer because I don't think anyone knows the answer. What's the correlation between ranking on bestseller list and MADRS score differential? Is the top selling antidepressant the one with the biggest MADRS score differential? I don't think so. I tried to do the analysis, and it's very difficult to, because as we talked about, the way that these things are measured is not consistent across drugs. They're measured at different time points, et cetera. I think that the effectiveness of a drug, especially in something as kind of soft around the edges as a psychiatric disorder, has very little to do with the efficacy. It has a lot to do, and especially today as we move more into like a demand-driven healthcare system where you have, so many of prescriptions being written through like consumer-facing demand-driven healthcare channels like HIMSS and these other telehealth platforms. Most people, like people that take antidepressants, I don't think like 95% of the people that take them know what the MADRS score on the clinical trial that got that drug approved was. No one cares. People care about, this is a new interesting antidepressant that I can try.
That maybe has less side effects than the one I was taking before.
And, it's actually psychedelics. That's kind of neat. So I don't think that as long as the MADRS score is high enough for it to get approved, I don't know that it matters beyond that.
That's actually a really good point. I was going to say, if there was any kind of clinical data point that might influence commercial success more, I was going to say just like the number of adverse events.
That's the other thing. People don't know what the MADRS score of their SSRI is, but they know that it caused them negative side effects.
Yeah.
Even if it did make them happier, they know it caused them to gain weight and lose interest in sex and that sort of thing. And so if the story is like, hey, this is a new antidepressant that doesn't have those side effects, you only have to take it one time, and that one time is actually kind of fun, you get to like trip a little bit, and it doesn't cause these negative side effects, that's like way more compelling than any, actually it's like a p-value of 0.003 with this MADRS score differential, blah,
but
blah, blah.
Do we think then that the new head of the FDA, given what he said publicly about the FDA needing to accelerate its review times and getting back to sponsors more frequently, coupled with his public like display of appreciation for the psychedelic research, do you think then that Compass is going to, after this is kind of, I guess it's finished, are they going to talk to the FDA, you think, and just see what they say about an NDA under the new administration? Because there's nothing bad about having early conversations with the FDA or more check-in, I forget what they're like, type A, type B meetings. I think the FDA generally welcomes that. So are we going to see if there's like maybe an attempt to gauge whether or not now's the right time?
Maybe. I suspect that they would finish because they're running two trials in parallel. They have the Compo 05, which is what was read out today, and then they have the Compo 06.
Yeah.
I suspect they'll at least finish the ones that they're in the process.
Or maybe get to like
running.
An interim readout with the second phase 3.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, I wouldn't count on anything the administration says as like, this is going to happen for sure.
Well, I wasn't saying that was going to directly influence what people do, but I think it's a signal that they're looking to review data more frequently and readily.
Yeah, I think they probably will. I would guess. But
so
who knows?
Okay, if I did my analysis and I want to know what you think of this. So I think there was like one analyst who like put out a report that downgraded the stock from like $11 to $6 or something. And I was trying to like put my head in the mind of this person and maybe why they decided to do this beyond what we just talked about. And maybe if we want to boil it down quantitatively, could it be a function of this delta over or in consideration of infrastructure risk in terms of commercial rollout?
Right. So let's say you get it approved. Is there enough infrastructure to actually deploy the therapy on a large scale?
Right.
That question. Well, I don't know because we don't have the copy of the report. We just know that it was downgraded from a price target of 11 to 6. So
yeah,
it's, I that's possible, but I don't think that's probably the main reason because that is not a new piece of information. Like concerns around infrastructure risk is not something that was newly revealed in this readout. That's something that one could have argued before.
Right. But there were like, I haven't read them. There was like a Deutsche Bank report that was put out by some analyst. And so maybe there was some sentiment already in the ether about what to expect.
Maybe.
I think someone mentioned that an analyst said for it to be commercially successful, the delta needs to be 4.5 or more. And I don't know what that has to do with, but I agree with you. I don't think it has anything to do with commercial ambiguity, at least on the payer and reimbursement side of things, because I know that Compass and many other groups have been pretty active about determining what the reimbursement codes would be with insurance. But I don't think that matters. So
I don't know. I mean, maybe we can see. We might be able to get a copy of that Evercore report somehow. We'll see.
Maybe
we'll try. Then
maybe that'd be nice.
But I think there's one. So the headline that we saw from that report was that it was downgraded from 11 to 6, meaning that's what their price target of the share value is.
Right.
And obviously that's not great. Like no one's celebrating that. But what's the value of the shares now? 2.3. So this is not saying they think it's going down. This is still a bull case. It's just less of a bull case than it was before.
Wait, say that again for my science brain.
Yeah, so the price target that they had before was $11 a share.
Okay.
They adjusted their price target to $6 a share.
But it's
currently $2.30. So this is not, they didn't say we think Compass is going down the toilet. They said we think it's going to be worth $6 a share.
I know, but do you think like people who are not sophisticated, like stock investors, will see something like that and interpret it erroneously and then
that's why I'm making
move?
the point. I'm saying, yes, they downgraded it, but their new price target is still it's more than double what the value currently is.
Yes. That's the reality.
They didn't change it to a sell. They didn't say sell Compass.
Right.
They said I don't know what they said, but the implication is it is now $2.35. We think it's going to go to $6.
The reactionary.
So if you took that as a sell signal, I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah. Well, that being said, I think generally what I've learned, both in science and in investing in like stocks and also private deals, most people will see headlines and they won't take the time to understand what's going on, which is why we're trying to record this podcast. But So is it safe to say, I'm learning here, that this was a reactionary like fall?
Yes, I suspect.
Okay.
I suspect. So the question is then, are we buyers of Compass at this price? That's the question. I mean, it's the market cap as of today's close. Today's Monday, June 23rd. Market cap or value of Compass, according to the stock market, is $220 million.
I think we should be.
That's their sort of like book equity value. If you look at like their assets minus their liabilities on their balance sheet as of last quarter, it's like 196 million. So it's like the market is valuing them at barely a premium above kind of like the balance sheet version of what they're worth. They have, I think, almost $260 million in cash. And they have a trial that showed that they have a thing that works. Maybe it didn't work as epically as some people were hoping, but it works. I suspect that this company will be worth a lot more in the future.
Yeah.
I don't think that I don't think that Comp 360 is not going to get approved. If you had like gun to my head, is this drug going to get approved within the next 3 to 5 years? And I can't equivocate. Yes is the answer. And at that point, this either goes up by at least several, doublings, or it becomes some sort of acquisition target for larger pharma. And you had an interesting prediction when we were talking about this earlier today about acquisitions.
I will share that, and I also have a question for you afterwards. Actually, maybe I should ask the question before I forget it. Does Compass currently have enough cash to get them through this phase 3 readout, the second phase 3 readout next year?
I didn't have time to look at their most recent report before we did this podcast, so I don't know.
That's a huge factor for me.
They have 196 million sitting in the bank, but they do have some short-term liabilities, and I'm not sure if those liabilities that are on the balance sheet account for whatever future payments they're going to owe to complete these trials. I didn't take the time to look into it.
We should do that analysis later. I'm curious, but yeah. So my prediction. I don't know. So look, I think that right now, what I've learned very acutely in the past little while is that the macro environment has really impacted biotech negatively. And I think that recently we saw Sage Therapeutics acquired for a less than ideal price, I guess. We see some like activity in the neuropsych space as of right now happening. There's also some private deals that are happening in neuropsych that are good. And then we also had the intracellular acquisition that happened at the beginning of the year for $14 billion, albeit they had an approved drug already in their arsenal. All of this to say that there's a lot of activity and attention in neuropsych. And I think a lot of the SMID and large cap pharma companies are looking at neuro very keenly. And so I think that most people will be paying attention to this. Now, I suspect that pharma companies also agree with us. I think they think that this is probably a valuable drug. It's representative of a new class of therapeutics. I suspect that depending on Compass's cash position, that much like Sage, there will be a few lowball offers made for an acquisition by some of these companies, whether it be to hedge against some of their existing successful drugs, to stack up against, patent cliffs that might be coming up with their pipeline of assets, perhaps J&J, or maybe it's going to come from a smaller company that already has a vested interest in Compass like Otsuka. But I wouldn't be surprised if we were to see something like that. And depending on Compass's position, it might be in their best interest to not take that, especially because perhaps there's a chance that the market recovers slightly by the time they have their interim readout for their second phase 3. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I would suspect that they will get at least a few offers. Totally not surprise me. As to whether they should take them or not, probably not. I think that I feel like they're able to get the resources they need to take this over the finish line.
Yeah.
And then they can start developing their, follow-on indications and other things. And
maybe they can do some regional deals instead.
Yeah, regional deals, exclusive licenses for Japan, other countries, that sort of thing. But yeah, it seems like with the backdrop of how pro-psychedelic the administration wants to be, and the fact that it seems like, I know everyone thinks that the capital markets are in a real shit position, but just in the last few weeks, it does seem like things are starting to loosen up. I would suspect that they can turn this into a successful business. And if I had to just put a bow on everything that we talked about, I don't think there's any universe where it makes sense that a drug, a company showing that a drug actually works, should result in a 50% haircut on the valuation of that business. It's crazy.
Especially in a segment that's ripe for disruption.
Yeah.
I have a few questions for you. I know we're probably trying to wrap up soon, but
we got to go to dinner.
We have to go to dinner.
10 minutes. So.
Don't mind all of this behind me. This is not for after dinner. We are expecting guests in the next little while, so we're trying to be prepared. But everyone in like the biopharma world talk about single asset companies. And effectively, that's exactly what Compass Pathways is. They have Comp 360, which is their single asset. How much do you think that this reaction is also a reflection of them being a single asset company?
I don't think it matters too much, because even if they had secondary and tertiary assets, whatever the primary asset in the pipeline is seems to just be able to control the company, whether positively or negatively. Not a lot of weight is put on those secondary and tertiary assets unless they're just as developed as almost the primary asset is. And I mean, some of the biggest deals in the past few years have come from single asset companies like Karuna. So,
okay. I have 2 points that I'd want to leave the listeners with. Is there anything that you would want to like leave people thinking about that are open questions, or something that you want to reiterate that we just talked about that you think is like effectively the most important thing to remember?
here's what I want to reiterate. This is not financial advice.
Yeah.
Do not go out and buy a bunch of Compass and then blame me if you lose money. I actually don't know if I have any Compass at the moment. I did for a while. I'm not sure if I still have it or not. So I may or may not hold positions in the securities being discussed on this podcast.
Full disclosure.
But yeah, I think the bottom line is, do not get too distracted by the headline number. These things need to be put into context. The result that was announced today was good, and there is a lot of room for additional data to come out and additional optimizations on things like dosing and measuring and support that can make this look really good. So I'm still bullish.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right. I have like a few points for those who maybe are curious about more technical aspects of this and how it might impact other psychedelic or psychedelic inspired trials. I think the first is that the molecule matters among many other parameters in clinical development. So I don't think that this should be taken as a signal or a market catalyst for the neuroplastogen class or the non-hallucinogenic class. I think that the science is unbelievably nuanced and different between each drug and different between each drug. So that's just one thing I'll say. These are all like first attempts at new molecules for new indications. That's that. The second thing is that I want everyone to question or do like some of their own research on how useful these primary endpoints actually are and how meaningful they are. The MADRS score, most of these are just subjective reporting measures. Perhaps there is room in the future to look at how technology can enhance the way we actually analyze the success of psychiatric drugs. Maybe Kernel can do something like that. I don't know. Just plugging them there. And the other thing that I would say is, if you're curious, the FDA released a guidance in June of 2023 on how to conduct psychedelic trials. One of the major topics that a lot of the analysts and bloggers have mentioned in some of these like articles today talk about something called functional unblinding and how that's difficult, or that comes with the territory with psychedelics. If you actually go and look at the guidance itself, they don't provide much guidance on this at all. So I think that's an open question as well.
That's true. All right. Well, with that said, I think we should wrap up because we got to get going.
All righty.
All right. Thank you, Sam. And for anyone listening, remember, this is not financial advice. We may or may not have positions in Compass Pathways. This is just commentary. Thank you.
All right. Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Brom.